All right, so I have chapter 6 here. Was it just an accident that he was here on this uninhabited island? Abel began to wonder. Was he being singled out for some reason? Was he being tested? If so, why? Didn't it prove his worth that such a one as Amanda loved him? Well, did it? Why did Amanda love him? He wasn't all that handsome, was he? And he had no particular accomplishments. Well, what sort of a mouse was he? Wasn't he really just a snob and a flop and frivolous on serious occasions, as Amanda had once told him during a quarrel? He had acted silly even at his own wedding, grinning during the solemnities, clowning around when cutting the cake. What made him act the way he did? Full of such questions, he went to wash his face in the river that kept him captive and drank some of its water. It was foolish, he realized, to harbor such a grudge toward a river. It had no grudge against him. It happened to be where it was. It had probably been there for eons. He found a bush of ripe raspberries and ate his fill for breakfast. This was his third morning on the island. Carefully cracking the few seeds that remained in his mouth, he thought again about a bridge. He decided he could make one out of rope, a single floating strand on which he could pull himself across. It would have to be strong enough so that the current wouldn't tear it, but light enough so that he could sling it across to the other side. He would tie a stone on one end and try to make it catch in some bushes that he'd picked out on the far shore. This time he proceeded methodically, not in nervous haste. He went first to defecate behind a rock, though no one was watching him. Then he cut long blades of tough crabgrass and sat cross-legged on the ground, tearing the grass lengthwise, so that each blade became more strands. He worked this way for hours, and he enjoyed the absorbing task. When he felt that he had enough, he proceeded to braid and weave the long fibers to form a continuous rope. Occasionally, he would encircle the rope with a few strands of grass and tie a firm knot to prevent unraveling. He was doing the kind of thing that he had often, leaning on his cane, watched others do. Noon passed. His thoughts concerned only the rope, its making, and how he could use it. But as the rope grew, Amanda, who was always somewhere in his mind, came forward. What was she thinking, he wondered. No doubt they had searched for him in a large area around the cave, dreading to find him injured or dead. But what did they make of not finding him at all? Had they gone after him right away? The hurricane would have prevented them from getting very far. He was certain that Amanda had to be restrained from risking her life to save him. They must have spent a sleepless night inside that cave and started looking early in the morning when the storm was over. By now, the whole town was certainly looking. His powerful father would have seen to that. They might look pretty far, but this far? Never. How frantic Amanda must be. But so much greater her joy will be when she will have him back again. It was evening when he'd woven enough rope to span the river. He had it neatly coiled on the ground in a large ring. It would be wise to wait till morning, though, before crossing over. If he crossed now, he'd have to sleep on the other side, where he'd be less at home than he was here, and he was tired. He ate the seed from the grass he'd worked with. It was scattered all around him. He drank at the river, and then, for diversion, he wandered toward the interior of the island, chewing on fragrant raspberries as he wandered. In a pleasant place, open yet sheltered by overhanging boughs, the hollow bole of a dead tree lay on the ground, so he entered it. Here's a picture of that. So he's wandering around and he sees this hollow, just dead tree kind of hollowed out, so he goes inside. Recalling his fall from the birch tree, he felt that this log would probably afford a safer night's lodging. He went to work carting out some of the rot. The log had limbs which were also hollowed by decay. It amounted to a house with several wings and rooms. No beast of prey could fit into that log or reach its beak, talon, fang, or claw deep enough to get at Abel where he planned to sleep. As for snakes, there were stones with which to close up the entrance when he went in. So he started to think about like predators and that he might be in danger if he's sleeping. So he's thinking that this log might be safer for him. He lay on his back for a while, Amanda's scarf held with both paws to his chest. Having worked all day, serious and well, he was warmed with a proper self-regard. He had provided food and shelter for himself, and woven a rope which would be his bridge to freedom, home, and love. He spent that night in the log, eager for the next morning. He believed that he could shoot his rope across the river by using his suspenders as a slingshot. Okay. Chapter 7. I'm going to read another one. At sunrise, Abel was at the river, where he washed, had breakfast, and got to work on his bridge. He set up his suspenders as a slingshot, fastening one end to a stout bush. Then he arranged his rope in a few long, loose loops that would straighten out easily as it arched over the gap. He tied one end to a stone and the other to the bush, made a pocket in his suspenders to hold the stone, and he was ready for his shot. Grasping the stone in its pocket and leaning backward, he pulled mightily, stretching the suspenders as far as the elastic would allow, and aimed his bridge, or lifeline, in the direction of the bushes on the opposite shore. Fervently hoping for success, he released his hold. The stone, with the rope trailing it, made a small parabola in the air, and the line, as if with a sigh, fell limply into the river only 90 taels away. He quickly hauled it in. A bit of faith still remaining, he set up his machinery and tried again, using a lighter stone. The result was even more disappointing. The rope was wet now and heavy. Abel tried swinging the rope around and around above his head with a gradually lengthening line and then releasing it like a bola. Here's a picture of that. He's like trying to wave it around his head in a circle and trying to release it to get it to fling across the river. This simpler method worked better than the suspenders, but not enough better to matter. He pulled in the rope and sat beside it, clutching his head in his paws. The stubbornness of his character stood him now in good stead. He refused to consider himself defeated. A few minutes of gloomy pondering produced a new idea: a bridge of stepping stones. Why hadn't he thought of this simple scheme before? He would make piles of stones, using each pile as a step to build the next one, until he'd made enough to walk or hop his way across the river. He spent the rest of the day amassing a huge heap of pebbles and rocks, going farther and farther afield to find them. And by sundown, he was so exhausted, he laid down in his log without even having eaten, and he fell asleep before the birds had even finished making their final evening statements. The next morning, after wolfing down a big breakfast, he stood in water up to his neck, building the first step. Here's a picture of him doing that. So he's building the first step of stones. He viewed his first step with satisfaction. He realized that the steps would have to be close together because he could make only a short leap carrying a heavy weight. He managed to build a second and a third step, but that was all. The would-be fourth step, which was started in swifter water, never even formed, because the current carried away the largest rocks that he could carry. It was a hopeless project. The middle of the river, if ever he could even reach it, was surely very deep. And even if the rocks held, the amount required to make a single step would be more than he could find on the island or carry in what remained of his life. He would keep thinking. It was his family tradition never to give up, but to keep gnawing away until problems were solved. For the time being, however, he had run out of ideas. He began to develop an obstinate patience. In the next few days, he discovered additional sources of nourishment. Ground nuts, mulberries, wild mustard, wild onions, new kinds of mushrooms, spearmint, peppermint, and milkweed. His former days of reading helped him identify these plants. He made a hammock of grass fibers and swung himself in it by pulling on a rope, swaying from side to side like seaweed on the rolling sea, full of vacant wonder. He was stunned with his own solitude, his own silence. Every night he slept in the log. It had become half hotel, half home. But he still regarded the birch as the focal point of his comings and goings. He would often climb it to scan the surroundings and sit there chewing on a twig. By the end of the month of August, he knew he was an inhabitant of this island, whether he liked it or not. It was where he lived, just as a prison is where a prisoner lives. He thought constantly of Amanda. He thought of his parents, his brothers, sisters, friends. He knew they were grieving, and he was moved by their grief. He at least knew he was alive. They didn't. What was Amanda doing? How did her days drag out? Did she still write poetry? Was she able to eat, to sleep, to enjoy her existence in any way? Her image was in his mind, as clear as life sometimes, and he smiled with wistful tenderness, remembering her ways. Amanda was dreamy. It often seemed she was dreaming the real world around her, the things that were actually happening. She could dream Abel when he was right there by her side. Abel loved this dreaminess in her. He loved her dreamy eyes. Wherever he went around the island, he wore Amanda's scarf around his neck, the ends tied in a knot. He would not leave it in the log. That, my friends, is the end of chapter 7. So Abel has been there for quite some time now. And he's changing a little bit. He's having to learn some new things, new ways of life. So it's getting kind of interesting that way. But he's not giving up. He's not giving up. He's still looking for ways to get off that island, get back to his friends and his wife and his easy life in the village. So we'll see what happens.